So I need to do a little test to get us started. How many of you have children under the age of 10 or hang out with them from time to time? If you could put your hands up. Good Lord. Not much banking going on around here. So my question is, you want to put your hands up if the answer is yes. That somebody introduces a ride-share scheme by which you can send your child to school with a trusted driver who has been vouched for by an algorithmic system with big data behind it. So if you think, yes, you would put your child under 10 in a car with a stranger that you haven't met, if it was okayed for you by big data, put your hand up. Not doing well. Those of you who would say, no way, Jose, put your hands up. Okay, so this is just by way of a slightly gratuitous test of whether the promises being made for data might be a tiny bit exaggerated. By the way, hi Melbourne, I'm sorry I didn't say hello to you earlier. How are you? I didn't do a test with you, but we'll...
Hello. Hello.
Hi. So, but I want to start by reviewing why it is that so many people are excited about big data, and it's not that I don't share the excitement and the kind of somewhat curious fascination, but I'll go through very quickly some of the highlights over the last, 2 to 3 years when people have been getting into the swing of things and cheering this subject on. Then I'm going to talk about things that numbers, big or small, can't and don't count, which for me is where the great majority of value in the future society and economy is going to be made and found. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about a particular example of a subject which I think probably touches most of you, if not in business, then certainly in your private lives. And I think one of the themes of this evening can be, where does business and where does the rest of our social connections overlap? But this, as you may know, is the National Security Agency's not yet finished building in Utah. X number of billions it's cost to make it. It's most famous for the fact that it contains gigantic amounts of information. And I guess you all know what a yottabyte is, but I didn't know until I learned about this new facility that it's not yet at a yottabyte, which is the largest number that anybody has come up with yet. But it's in this building, so they say, all of the books ever written in any language, or the contents of 62 billion iPhones. So that's what it will be able to contain at any one moment by way of its inventory of data. Here you see, those are not the servers, those are just the human beings who will fill the servers and do whatever they're doing. This is the actual server farm down the road in Bluffdale, which I think begins to raise my suspicions that the whole thing may possibly have been invented, which is, as it says, I don't know if you can read that, this is the Total Information Awareness Facility server farm, which is so totally information aware that they've located it in a desert, and it requires 3 million gallons of water per day to cool it down. So that's how information aware it is. And here is where I think the future of the empire comes most seriously into question, because this is a real photograph of the Information Dominance Center constructed by the general in charge of the program, who my journalist friends tell me is now completely seriously referred to as General Strangelove. And there are two things about this photograph which is pretty odd. One is that it's curiously reminiscent of something many of us may have seen before. And the other is the kind of model of relating to information represented by the single black chair in the middle. And for those of you who hadn't already got it, there is the original Starship Enterprise control deck, and there is the ghastly, sleazy, badly made version, and he has probably 1,000 times more money to spend. So apart from the threat to democracy and the panopticon of the world, he couldn't even find a decent design company to make a proper replica of the Starship Enterprise. But what is most shocking to me seriously is this notion going backwards and forwards, that then the proper relationship to information is to have one all-powerful person controlling it from one chair. So this kind of bit, not exactly peer-to-peer mental model of how the world is going to be run. That is, so to speak, reflecting the thinking and the strategy behind the whole kind of concept of this data gathering exercise. So yes, of course, some individual military people are a bit loopy, but the system as a whole is thinking in terms of aggregating data as an end in itself. And the crucial question is, I'm getting confused because it's all these things on here, so is where that impinges on the way that companies and businesses are thinking about the same subject of the amount of data available to be mined once aggregated. And the world of, it's not promotional, it's people are genuinely excited. 600 million users added 30 billion pieces of content to Facebook last month. It's one of these tremendously impressive, if moderately mysterious pieces of information. Or the average teenager, and I think this is a North American teenager, sends 4,762 texts per month. There are 32 billion tweets per month, not all of those by me. And by 2015, 3 billion people will be online. So you know the kind of language of these big and possibly exciting but otherwise opaque numbers. But the kind of business case is something called a 360-degree view of customers, or that big data, and this is from 2011, McKinsey's most recent excited pronouncement, the next frontier for innovation, competition, and productivity. Okay, lots of excitement, lots of numbers, lots of new words. Just that I'm a kind of a cynical person, if I look at where the focus of these development and innovation arguments come from, they're basically to do with suggesting that things like cities or large institutions need to spend large amounts of money on updating their heavy back-end infrastructure and all that consulting in order to deal with all this big data. And the Pentagon has helpfully suggested that 1 or 2 billion a year should do the trick as long as you spend that every year. But they, this market for what they call back-end services, but it's in the language and the mentality and the expectation of very large, heavy infrastructure, similar in scale and concept to a road or an airport. It's not only that, there's also the absolute mania for so-called health apps based on big data. There's, 200 startups every 2 months or something just in the US in the space called health apps. If you haven't come across this phenomenon, there's a company called Rock Health, which is a startup fund that only deals with health apps. The basic promise being that if you aggregate the data from very large numbers of people who have illnesses and or want to connect information about what things work for their health, this will transform the medical industrial system. Other people promise that there will be 600 billion in consumer surplus every year. I've never properly understood that sentence. I just therefore interpret the picture which it comes with, which is there's an obese man driving too close to the car behind, eating a chocolate bar and perusing a whole range of new consumer opportunities, which will be followed by him having a crash into the car in front of him, which will generate all sorts of value-adding medical activities and transactions for everybody's concerned. So I can't help thinking that's the business model there. And for you guys, if you aren't personally yet at this moment in the personal data tsunami, they think they need at least 190,000 people with deep analytical skills to do it, whatever it is, and that obviously means you guys. So there's lots of jobs in it, whatever it is. And then the kind of things that, why I'm here tonight, because this is the sentence that I saw which triggered me and got me irritated but also perplexed about what could this possibly mean. 90% of the world's data was generated in the past 2 years. What can that possibly mean? Because I think that it's possibly arguable that's true for digital information, things that have been rendered into digital form. But there's one or two things that is left out by the conflating the word information to things that are digital, namely everything else in the history of life on Earth that contains information by virtue of 3.5 billion years of evolution, living systems on a micro and a macro scale, the planet, climate, biodiversity, forests, human culture, social information, and so on. All that, too, is information and knowledge. It's just not digital. And so the basic starting point for my argument this evening is how dangerous it is if we imagine and shape our ambitions for the economy and for society about such a narrow slice of the total knowledge picture. Which takes me on to part two, because what data, and big or small, numbers in general, sir?
Sorry, just a quick question. Where did that sentence come from?
Which sentence would that be?
One about the data here.
That one? I can give it to you afterwards. I just took it from the Financial Times, I think. Yeah. IBM study. So, is it more or less? We'll argue. Tell me in the Q&A. It's there as an example of a kind of excitable statement rather than a scientific thing. I don't think anybody can measure it in a literal sense, can they? I don't think so. Just sounds cool. So there's analog data, and then this is where the very strange phenomenon comes in, is that the business world is encouraged to celebrate the sheer mystery of this kind of very enormous amounts of information. So the Financial Times Alphaville columns, probably I guess many of you read, invented the word, the desert of the real, to describe their understanding of a market and a global economy whose complexity and speed of change has exceeded the capacity of ordinary people to understand. But I think there's a form of madness taking place here, so I wanted to show you the full spirit of that desert of the real piece against the background of Perth Central Business District, which I was at earlier on my visit to Australia. Today's market is the most infinitely complex, impossible object ever imagined, and for the investor to thrive in it, he or she must think creatively and be adaptable to the changing modes of acuity. You must be able to imagine different realistic states of the world and think as both the mathematician and the artist. It's kind of, this is kind of pop business psychobabble, and it's very kind of a good way to describe something. But what is it actually describing? Is there any actual sense there? That's my question. Because I think this celebration of abstraction, this celebration of quantity, actually has a very dangerous consequence, which is to distract our attention from things that are more important and more meaningful and more likely to impact the futures that we and our families and children have. And this is one of my favorite Doomer films, The Road. Have you seen that? So the world has come to an end, it's gone grey, and they're kind of trudging to an unknown destination. And I choose to believe that this is what happens when big data so obscures people's focus on what really matters that things come to a sticky end. Amongst, quickly, the forms of knowledge that are obscured by looking only at things that can be digitized are, for example, thermodynamic knowledge, the amount of energy required to keep the world moving, with or without data. It's a complicated and interesting story. The short version is that on the left is a hunter-gatherer who in 10,000 years ago would need, roughly speaking, 5,000 kilocalories of energy to keep himself going, clothes, maybe a bit of fire, a bit of skin to shelter himself by. On the right is the man climbing the Shard last year in London, a typical groovy London with a hoodie, the whole works. He needs, together with his personal needs and his share of the London and the British economy and the global economy, 300,000 kilocalories a day. His body is not much materially changed from the body of the hunter-gatherer, but what he needs to keep going is 60 times more and rising exponentially. So, question number one, is that kind of knowledge captured by the big data interest? I don't think so. But if we don't think about it, we're going to pay a horrible price when energy difficulties, if we can put it neutrally, come and get us later on. The out of sight, out of mind kind of knowledge, the fact that we live increasingly isolated and blind to the very messy and real costs of the economies that we run in our different ways. This is a slurry from one of the Chinese mines where the specialty minerals are taken out of the ground for our phones and our gadgets. We don't see them, we don't touch them, we don't smell them, we don't hear much about them, but that knowledge is important to the thrivability of the planet and the living systems upon which we all depend, even if we don't see it or think about it. This is my favorite. Does anybody speak German in this room? A bit? Can you say that word at the top, in the blue? Congratulations. Anyway, it is basically a German word which says things don't always go according to plan and prognosis. That is to say, complex systems across the board have the capacity to change dramatically when a small thing happens, even if the accumulation of small things before that moment hasn't had a visible or a dramatic effect. It's the notion of the phase shift, the tipping point. That kind of knowledge is pretty important in regulating the way we inhabit the world, totally missing from the notion that you mine data and get very kind of reliable forecasts of how things are going to move along. Situated knowledge, the knowledge that is, how do people operate on the street in the informal context of messy urban situations? You can capture data about what they say to each other on phones, but just like your own experience must be that what you say on your phone or in a kind of message is a tiny part of the kind of person-to-person breathing the same air work that you do on the street. So my argument is, fine, big data can tell you about patterns of movement around a city or about what people are buying on a certain corner, but that's only a small part of a bigger picture which we would be foolish to ignore. And informal knowledge. This is something on this trip, I've talked to a lot of people about where they think the economy is going, and nobody in Australia seems to even mention the word informal economy or the informalization of economic activity around the world. But everywhere else, that is pretty much the number one topic, namely the OECD, which is not a kind of excitable organization, has estimated, put it neutrally, that between 60 and 65% of all adults in the world will be working in one way or another informally by 2020, which is to say the number of people who have jobs, credit cards, pensions, and to whom you can sell financial products based on their sort of stable lifestyles will be 35% of the whole, and the other 65% will be doing something which is much less easy to kind of model, much less easily to mine for data and so on. But if you decide to only focus on the kind of known, the fixed, the mineable, that's 35% of the adults. Is that where you want to end up? I don't know. Social knowledge, the knowledge that people have by virtue of inhabiting communities, looking after children. 50% of the hours spent by most adults are spent looking after each other, just being at home, doing stuff that is not recorded as a transaction, but obviously contains a huge amount of creativity. And now my favorite bit, which is the least close to what I imagine you talk about daily, but what I think is really, this is where Avatar meets, I don't know, Blade Runner. The fact that data is a form of knowledge which is very precisely measured and numbered and counted. It's more or less at the opposite of what neuroscientists and all sorts of cultural observers are understanding, that bodies and brains are hormonal. We are not just a kind of box with a computer in our heads, that our bodies are translucent and absorb chemicals from our environment, as do all sorts of other creatures, and that therefore our embodied intelligence is turning out to be a far bigger part of our identity and how we experience the world than the rational stuff that counts numbers. In other words, when you measure what's happening to a brain, after 30 years of research, scientists know roughly 5% of what it does. The other 95% remains a mystery. And that's the human brain, which we are talking about, mining it for data and behavior. And then nature itself turns out to be far better than us at the internet. Have you seen this just amazing work in the last period about nature's internet? The mycorrhiza, the network of roots and literally nerves that connect trees and ecosystems over vast areas. For every man, woman, and child on the earth, there's 3 tons of mycorrhiza in the earth somewhere, all in one way or another connected together. This is just a major revolution in understanding how we inhabit the planet. It doesn't figure whatsoever in the kind of normal models that you see about knowledge and its behavior. There are some bees on an acacia tree. I'm running a tiny bit over, so I just jump over to this picture of hormonal body, and to say that the Buddha knew this 2,500 years ago. The kinds of knowledge that I'm describing about how we experience the world, why we behave in different ways, how we relate to each other, how we relate to our context, are beginning to reconnect with very ancient forms of knowledge that, so to speak, knew this all along, but we've tended to kind of brush aside. And certainly in terms of counting things with data, that's another side of the picture. So there's the Buddha, and there's one of the people from the Omo people in East Congo who are known to experience their worlds polyphasically, using very large numbers of combinations of different senses, from proprioception to smell and so on, which gives them a very, very different and probably much deeper understanding of their natural environment than we would have by going and looking at it or taking pictures of it with our instruments. Primitive, not advanced, but obviously possibly another world of knowledge and understanding that we need to know about. So to conclude the things that data can't count, I think if you look at all those embodied things, things by way of having bodies, things that are social, connected, what they have in common is that a large amount of human affairs run on the basis of trust, which is not, so to speak, embodied in contracts or represented by institutional frameworks, but is just embedded in communities. And that, I would suggest, is what is at danger and actually outright threatened by a view of the world in which if you can count it, you can control it, which is the NSA basic model. If you have that idea, then you're committed to investing infinitely growing amounts of effort in the control of reality and the monitoring of reality. Whereas if you trust people, if you trust each other, you don't have to do it at all. You don't have to monitor them for 1 second. If the person that you put your child in the car to take to school, if you trust that person, you don't think for 1 second more about her safety when she gets to school. If you have to have a kind of a system of data mining and kind of observation and spying on everybody on the planet, the effort expands to infinity. So here are my takeaways before I give you my example. Value lies in that which cannot scale. I'm not saying that value, therefore, is easy for a big company to access and to use. I'm just asserting my opinion and my judgment about that in the future will be valuable, that is unique to the place. You can't duplicate a place. You can duplicate a picture of a place. You can duplicate a digital description of a place, but you can't duplicate the place itself. Knowledge and behavior that is embodied in human beings. We are all different from each other. The more different we are, the more diverse we are as people, the greater the value that a community and a group has. That which is shared, it's very difficult to reproduce, copy, or take to a third place a shared activity or a shared value system, for example. The trust question. Things that are alive, by definition, for the most part, are alive in a place. They have a context, they have a history. If you're interested in that which is unique and special rather than global and commodified, those are the things in the future that are valuable. So my provocation to you this evening is that is where the future economy is going to be made, is finding ways of helping unique, embodied, shared activities prosper. And I'll finish 4 or 5 minutes with an example which may possibly shock you, namely the notion of the people-powered care. So, you had Rachel Botsman here in Amplify, so I gather. So you've had the whole story about the shareable economy as a fantastic opportunity for services to support sharing resources of all kinds. It's a very powerful new version of something which goes back throughout human history. It's a cultural feature that doesn't have to be nourished. It's there. It's just been obscured in the recent past. What has not yet been looked at so closely is what the consequence of a sharing economy might be for health and care in an era when we are facing really huge challenges in terms of cost, appropriateness, who is going to kind of get access to health treatments and so on. And I don't know how many people here, and I'm not going to ask you to say this, have somebody that they know in their family or they know of who has dementia or is affected by it. But it's one of the major issues that is perplexing policymakers and social theorists and basically everybody about what an aging society means. It's not just an abstract thing when somebody you know becomes ill and somebody has to look after them, etc., etc. And in the UK context, I didn't manage to find recent numbers for Australia, but the number of sufferers will double every 20 years now that we've reached a certain demographic profile. And that 700,000 citizens with the disease means 3 million people directly affected. Family members, somebody, people who have to be involved in the consequence of somebody getting this disease. Oh my God, the cry goes up. What is the government going to do to look after all these people with dementia? And all over the world, people are having this discussion. What are we going to do? What kind of services will the government need to create? By what process, and who will pay for them, etc. The small problem with that question is that it's the wrong question. The government is not going to look after the people with dementia because it can't. It won't because it can't. I'll explain that, but the notion that a service is something that is cooked up in a design studio or government agency and delivered to an old person or their carer like a pizza does not correspond to the nature of care as it is now. And it's by asking the question, what kind of service will somebody cook up and sell or deliver or give away free to look after people will take us down. A gross misallocation of resources will be in trouble. So the better question is, what practical actions would improve daily life for people with dementia and their carers? That is to say, not cure it, not do things to them, but actions that would change the ecosystem, the social context that is there right now. So that changes the question in a rather kind of dramatic way. Oh, the picture has totally disappeared. How interesting. On that picture that has disappeared is a shot from an exploratory design process in which 200 people with dementia and their families were asked in a design process, what are the steps that could be taken to improve your situation? Not how can we cure it, but how can we help you improve your situation? And the very powerful thing that came out of that process was a shared perception of priorities with the sufferers, family members, professionals, doctors, policy members, and everybody else, which is basically that forms of social support, often of a very tiny kind, were what the people who are at the front line now would most value and most call for. Social support, very small. Respect at the end of the life is a difficult subject, but that was number 2. And number 3 was support for the carers. And the subject of assistive technology or complicated technical solutions to dementia, very low down the list, 18%, often lower as a number. The problem with that being that for most policymakers, not they're bad people, but they look for something that they can put money into, which will create a thing that will solve the problem. And if it's an assistive technology house or an assistive badge that they can put on people, so whatever, it's what is needed and what is easy to make are two different things. So that is why the kind of averaging out data-based solution is so difficult. But that leads on to a different way of understanding the innovation context, namely to look at the support ecology for dementia that already exists, to look at the formal and the informal suppliers of help and assistance, then to break that down into small relationships, and you've all done this kind of mapping exercise in your business, I guess, with your clients or kind of markets. But if you take the same concept of social mapping, apply it to a community of people in which people have dementia, you can begin to identify one-to-one relationships between people that may not be working well, intervene in whatever way to improve the one-to-one relationship, and that transforms the care ecology bit by bit. And that's where the notion of the trust and the big data and the social and the embodied start to go hand in hand. I don't actually know how. All I know is that what we said at the beginning with the subject of the parents and the children applies equally to old or people who are ill. You're not going to entrust their care to agents of some service that has been selected anonymously by a system or by an algorithm. You need to have the human element, but the kind of the analytical approach and the big data, as with Facebook and everything else, can help, which is why people are now coming forward with products that these guys think they can monetize trust. I'm not sure they can, Trust Cloud, but that's what their story is. I think the more likely tools that will come through are going to be public domain, open source ways of modeling trust amongst groups of people. My favorite example is Mozilla Badges. Do you know about Mozilla Badges? I'm going to stop in 2 minutes in case you're worrying. So Mozilla Badges is the opposite of, do you know about Trust Cloud before I confuse you? Have you heard of Trust Cloud? Okay, sorry. Well, the thing I showed you is a startup in America saying, how do you, using lots of algorithms and lots of data, create a platform to generate trusted relationships between people who don't know each other, so you can very rapidly build teams of people to help, for example, do a project or look after people who are sick. The problem being is that it's based on a business model that requires it to be automated, otherwise it won't make a lot of money, and that's why the Trust Cloud thing will work perfectly for 30-year-olds sharing rides in the Bay Area, will not work perfectly for older people who need a bit more personal contact. It's a hybrid model that we're looking for. And in Mozilla, they have this fantastic, it's a free software movement. They made Firefox and many other things. How do you trust somebody's statement that I'm really good at algorithms, or I'm good at budgets, or I'm good at team leadership, or I'm good at buying hamburgers? Answer, you get the team of people who has worked with them to, in real time, give them a score, and to that score is attached a badge. And so the badges platform is a very powerful way to begin the process of allocating trust to people based on real connections. It's still virtual online. What I love it is it reminds me of when I was in the Pony Club and I got badges when I could go over a certain height. And if you were in the Boy Scouts, do we still have the Boy? Who was in the Boy Scouts? Oh, little gentle things. Did you get badges? Yeah. This is what's brilliant about this, because you get badges again. Isn't that great? I love getting badges. So, and this is an open source, open domain, peer reviewed, and so it will provide one part of the picture. But to conclude, sorry, that's a bit washed out again. The trick is going to be to recognize that big data and all its accompanying frameworks will provide genuine insight and value, but it is only going to be part of a bigger picture when it comes to tackling and creating social value on things like dementia, aging, climate change, food, whatever. Anything that requires people to trust each other a bit more and do things together, data by themselves will not be enough. This is one of the platforms that are emerging called Libba. It's basically just showing you the range of activities that need to be coordinated, ranging from mentoring to training to building social media platforms. It's a good, you'll have to look on their website, lybba.org, see the way that they are beginning to explicitly design processes that combine the virtual, the numerical and digital, and the real world as a kind of hybrid process. And I think that's an exciting part of where the future will be. I've gone a bit over my 30 minutes, but I wanted to just tell you about a real-world example, and now you can tell me what your take on that would be. Thank you.